Rob is on vacation, so she's not with us today. We're going to be taking some notes, some meeting minutes. So we'll call it to order. We'll take a roll call. See who's here. Wendy here. Dorothy. Here. Karen. Here. I see Sean is with us.
Here.
Line and Lisa guy.
Christy?
I see Christy's online. Are there any members of the committee that I didn't mention? No, that would constitute a roll call for purposes of calling you to order. Next item on the agenda is a discussion of the ARPA related questions. Do we have any?
No, we haven't.
Oh, good. So we can then move on to the third, which is a review and discussion of federal, state, and local sources of funding and the funds mapping.
So I will give an update. Feel free to chime in. Sarah,
Thank you.
Met yesterday
to go over this. So
we've
we've
taken
what is a
what is
really
the comprehensive
report from Jared and Civil Links.
Was that made? Is that available to everybody? We made it available to
We haven't, we can certainly.
So what Vera and I have been trying to do is to map that out. So we're trying to take, it is a comprehensive review of everything we've discussed today, analysis of the federal spending of ARPA funds, the state spending of ARPA funds, regional allocations of ARPA funds, local allocations of ARPA funds, and what we know about all of that today. I think it's important to get that sort of crystallized into at least one graph, infographic, but probably more like 3. So that work continues, and I think we will be able to share that with you in 2 weeks.
So is that just for our use, or is that a public help tool?
I think it's going to be a public tool. For example, the Assembly has asked for an update from the committee, so next Wednesday, Vera will be there.
Well, the substance of the next week is really talk them through the ARPA portal and what's going on with that, basically the 10 million.
Yeah.
It's I'm not called to speak about the advisory committee.
They've called me to speak. So
okay.
Owen reached out late this afternoon.
Okay, that was unaware of that.
So if we had that kind of collateral material, that would be good to show the Assembly moving forward. But I did spend a couple hours in Cowboy yesterday, so it's coming up. It is coming up. So I think that brings us to the discussion and ranking of the regional challenges relative to ARPA. And as we mentioned last week, this is going to become important for discussion of the mega projects, given the funds that are available. And it will also be an important component potentially of the review of grants that come through the portal on the proposal that we talked about last week. Which last week we referred to as small and large grants.
Small, medium, and large.
Yeah, so we have changed the nomenclature a little bit. So small grants program now will be that grant program with a minimum of 100,000 and a maximum of 250,000. The medium grants program will be 250 to $500,000, and the large grants program will be the mega grant program. So we are still considering a proposal to the commissioners to allocate $5 million for the small and medium grants program. And that is what we'll be discussing next on the agenda. But I do think we have to have this discussion about ranking 6 regional challenges. It's hard without going through any sort of artificial process to discuss ranking that. So I'm open on discussions, and maybe it would be better for the committee to discuss what criteria we should use when we sort of are evaluating the regional challenges and ranking.
Well, a suggestion and a question, I mean, perhaps in terms of ranking, we look at urgency. You know, market forces that are gonna affect housing, that's, you know, things we can control or not control, but if we get ahead of it, under a more urgent issue. I have a question, and I don't know who can answer this, but maybe Dorothy with her climate hat on, but the Supreme Court is poised to make some changes that could structurally impact what we do as a nation for climate.
The major case,
Yeah, well,
issue case.
unless something's embedded in statute, it won't matter.
Because the legal terminology I'm getting wrong, but exactly.
So just to know how that affects us and this climate change as a regional challenge, or, you know, again, it's that of the moment. And like today, we think we're on a good track, but in a week from now, it could be, there could be something different. I just want to throw that out there or see.
The changing landscape, what you're talking about, yeah.
And I don't know, I guess, Dorothy, that would change what we are required to do versus what we're able to do.
Well, because, and again, I haven't read enough on it at this point to be able to respond in a meaningful way. But from what I understand, what it would say is that unless Congress specifically delegates to an executive agency specific empowerment of responsibilities, that you could individually litigate the rulemaking from EPA relative thereto. So I don't know how far down that would go, because if you started thinking about that and the delegation to administrative agencies, would that also apply, for example, if the mask mandated specific things? If there was requirements even as to forever chemicals in water, could those be individually litigated? So my understanding is that it's undermining, if decided this way, and then is this your take on it as well? That it would actually undermine administrative ability to set regulations and set like limits and sub-limits, for example. So in clean heat, for example, right now, what we're gonna, the task of the commission is to make recommendations relative to sector limits. Would those all be litigatable? So I don't know, and you have done a great job thinking through what the potential ramifications could be for us in terms of urgency, because what it could take away is the mandate to do things. And they would have to be undertaken in a voluntary way. So that may actually mitigate in favor of addressing some of these issues in the near term. Is that the point you're making? Yeah, I don't know at this point, and I'm not sure everybody understands what the ramifications are.
So I would take that as a good question that we would then get the experts to give us feedback on in 2 weeks. My understanding, maybe it's not complete, is that ruling would only affect federal from the EPA. So Massachusetts EP, EOA would set their own standards that we still have to comply with.
What I heard some legal speculation about today was that that would directly only affect through this rulemaking the federal agencies, but because it could empower the legal concept to be invoked by district courts to actually challenge the legislation, administrative rulings as well. That isn't for sure.
Yeah, I could see that where there would be then subsequent state filings. So we'll get a more definitive rundown and report on that for 2 weeks. So urgency, I think, is certainly one criteria that we would want to look at.
Ability to move the needle.
Right. So some discussion about potential economies of scale, given the pool of money that's available and the size of some of these challenges and what some of the potential solutions are under each one. You know, I mean, broadband is a good example of that, you know, where there's not enough money to do a complete last mile program for the Cape, but there's certainly enough money to support towns that want to look at creating municipal utilities for broadband. Dorothy.
I guess two things. One is we've been discussing through the mapping with Civilytics, the other flows of funds, as you know, Karen has pointed out, for example, in terms of healthcare. And so I guess one of the questions would be, is there a gap, a funding gap in terms of this need, or are there available funds to address it from other sources? And then Wendy, you brought up early on just being cognizant of the time frame. You used the term shovel ready, not, you know, not sure you meant it literally, but just being aware of the time constraints.
Excellent. Right. Go ahead,
I
Karen.
think it might have already been in what you discussed, but impact is somehow we need to get to the outcome, the impact. And what does that mean? Is it number of people? Is it towns? Is it?
Yeah, so impact in terms of having measurable outcomes, maybe also impact in that has to have a broad enough regional impact, can't have an overly localized sort of component.
And I do feel like part of it is, and I don't remember what you said, Paul, are we talking about prioritizing for the medium and large and not the small, or? Because it sort of changes the frame of reference for me.
Yeah.
Just for the large.
Yeah, for the large projects.
Mega. Okay.
But yeah, we don't like mega anymore.
Well, it was.
Yeah, exactly.
Funding gap.
It would impact or outcome.
And if you go back to the original conversation, when Senator Sear spoke to us and we were talking about, you know, they would like to see making real progress on an issue versus a one-time fix.
Right.
That was what I was just trying to remember.
Yeah.
Is sustainable impact as well, to your point. And we had a whole conversation about that relative to wages. You could underwrite them for a short period of time, but if you didn't structurally change the talent structure and the availability of that wouldn't have a long-term effect. That was sitting here trying to remember that point. Thank you.
Okay, so sustainability is obviously an important criteria, and I think maybe sort of if an issue area is one where there could be a transformational proposal, right? And I think something that changes the structure is probably tied to sustainability in some way.
Well, and it's not even, I don't think anything in life is 100%, right? So if we could just look at the longest arc of impact, that, you know, at some point, we build wastewater, at some point that's gonna have to be rehabbed. You know,
Right.
We build broadband, who knows when it's gonna have to be put back up on the poles because of hurricane. You know what I mean? So let's not get ourselves all bunched up and try to think
No.
of what. I'm all for what's gonna enable the next thing, right? So if we can build wastewater, that's gonna enable housing.
Right.
If we build broadband, it's gonna work at a higher wage. So good, right? So
maybe we limit the definition of sustainability to mean we would be less interested in projects that ran for, say, 3 years, but then we're looking for funding in year 4. Right, so, because that creates a problem. We don't want to start a project that's not going to reach its outcomes with the available resources on the table.
And I was hearing something different from this, which is, I was thinking as well, I mean, because I think that's an important point. But I was also thinking of the dominoes, and Wendy, when you went into that, that really got to the thing I was sort of niggling with, which is the sustainable change, if you think about it in terms of secular versus cyclical in the economy, if it could initiate a series of changes or make possible a series of changes that have sustained impact. So Wendy's example is perfect, which is you need wastewater for housing. The wastewater isn't necessarily going to create the housing, but it makes possible the housing.
Right. So catalysts.
Yeah, or necessary preconditions.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing too about housing, I mean, I would put that at the top of the list. Except it needs of underlying supports. And I also, the thing that I've been hearing more and more is that the only way that we can get to affordable housing or housing that our workforce can be accommodated in is through government subsidies. But it's such a hairball too, right? Because so we enable a whole bunch of housing and does that a fiscal cliff at some point? Does that just fix it short term? We fill a need for the next 3 to 5 years and then I don't know. It's like we don't have enough money to do housing. Just build houses for people who can come here and live. That's kind of what we need to do. Or keep the people that we have here, but.
Dorothy.
Did you?
No, you go first.
Oh, okay. So, no, it's just,
You're my blind spot.
that when you're in person, it's so hard. Yesterday, we had an in-person meeting and I looked at the screen to see the next person. To Wendy's point, just looking at it from a different way. If you, again, getting to the dominoes, if you use ARPA funds in a way that can create the preconditions for the creation of housing, which may in fact leverage subsidies or investment, which is and the reason I'm thinking of this is just, we were just talking about, for example, our operations center, okay? And the Penrose is applying for tax credits for that. But, let's not use that as an example. Let's use a standalone building. Let's say there's a multiple unit building that you want to create affordable rental in. And you're going to have investors that are willing to invest in it as long as they get the tax credits that subsidize that return. But in order to make that happen, you actually have to have connectivity to the sewer system. So that would be a case where you're not underwriting that affordable housing, you're creating it through the preconditions of the wastewater to sewer connection, and you're leveraging other sources of funds as well. So, I guess just a different way of thinking about that. Thank you.
Yeah. So the point being, if we took, a sizable amount of the money, 5 or 10 million, and just put it into a subsidization plan, that's only going to produce X number of units, right? And it's not transformational, given the number of units that would likely produce. But if wastewater is put in place in like an activity center, and then zoning's changed to encourage multifamily development, appropriate density, it becomes market driven after that point, but that really does become more transformational in nature.
Do that.
And Paul said exactly what I was going to say. It really, wastewater is top on my list for all the reasons that you described. Housing is our number one issue, but we can't get.
Sorry, didn't hear you.
Housing is the number one issue for so many, but we can't
But
get.
there are things that can make.
Precursors are wastewater, yeah.
And to,
Has there been more conversation on solutions for help for childcare?
Yeah, I mean, there's childcare. There was a big piece of federal legislation that looked promising earlier, until a certain West Virginia senator decided they didn't want to do it. That would have, I think, provided enough resources to the state to do universal pre-K statewide. But the state Senate has acted. They have a big childcare piece in their budget that'll be conference. So actually talked to Senator Moran earlier in the week, and she's hopeful that will survive conference. And so that'll bring some resources. But based on what the Advocacy and Action program that we did, the interesting thing on childcare is really on the local level. If you look at what Jackie Beebe's doing in Eastham, for example, with less than 2% of her municipal budget, she's able to offer direct childcare subsidies to providers on behalf of residents and employees with no income qualification. So that has now caught fire in Orleans and Chatham, but those outer Cape towns don't have a lot of children, and they have smaller populations. So we also heard from Patty DeBoers, the superintendent of Mashpee, because the Mashpee school system runs a universal pre-K system. So it at least initially looks like in some of the lower populated towns, the municipal governments might be able to get in and provide meaningful subsidies, but as we get into the mid-Cape and the upper Cape and larger populations, the school systems will at least have to be part of that solution. And that was kind of fascinating to me. But we have one example in Mashpee and another example in Eastham of local action. So even if the state steps in, makes universal pre-K a reality, kids still need a place to go at 2:30 or 3 p.m. until 5. And so we're hopeful that some of the municipal efforts might be able to wrap that around. So there are things happening on childcare and early education, but we don't have enough childcare slots on the Cape, and the slots that we do have are too expensive. Dorothy.
And so then in that picture that you've painted, what is the role of, for example, the YMCA, that's undertaking the Head Start program, as well as offering, other childcare? Where does the federal Head Start piece fit in, as well as the nonprofit part?
Yeah, well, the Y has the federal Head Start program now.
Right.
Not enough slots, though.
Okay.
Still. And the commission is doing a study to identify all of the providers around, so that we'll have some more hardcore data moving in that direction. Karen?
Not enough slots or not enough workforce to fill this. I think it's more of a workforce.
Constrained by both, also some physical constraints. But I believe they have received some resources to build out the facility a little bit more. Sure.
So David, loved your email today. Like, so your staffing constraints, are they primarily affected by housing or childcare, or can you tell why you have open positions?
I know that housing is an ongoing, increasingly difficult component, but quite frankly, there's a complete dearth of applications. Some of it has to do with the whole Great Resignation. That's what I've watched for a year or two. Long-term employees who are changing careers. Childcare, certainly I have at least 2 employees or former employees who are stay-at-home moms now. So really, there is no one answer.
Yeah.
I've lost a young woman who's leaving next week to move to Providence to live with her father because of housing. So we've got some housing, some childcare, and Great Resignation all rolled into one. Yeah. There is no one answer.
Yeah, that remains some of mystery, sort of exactly where the workforce has gone. But we do know, as it relates to the seasonal workforce and hospitality, the H-2B and the J-1s are a big component of that. So the J1s, especially sponsorship organizations, are asking employees for the first time to provide housing and directing potential J1 employees that want to come to Cape to other parts of the country. So,
I know it's hard to see, but Lisa has her
Oh,
hand up.
hi, Lisa.
I just.
Hi. I'm sorry, I may have missed this and I can't see it.
you're on mute. We had this discussion yesterday, Lisa and I, about how every time on Zoom feels like the first time.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I just didn't
can't
catch,
hear you.
who was that, who was speaking?
Oh, wait a minute.
I think Sean can hear me.
I had the issue the other day that nobody.
The chat.
No, there you go.
Okay, I was just, who was that, who was speaking about child?
Does someone have a microphone on?
Mine.
It's on too, right?
The owl's on. the
That's
owl's-
broadcasting and it's being picked up by other
Yeah.
people's.
Try again, Lisa.
I just was wondering, who was it that was speaking about the workforce and childcare? The gentleman was?
Oh, David Trout.
Trout.
Do you
Yeah.
know David? David, Lisa spent a lot
A
of time
member of the
together
public is
yesterday.
here.
Every day.
Okay,
Well,
So-
I'm just gonna throw out there, and I'm sorry, I know I should raise my hand. I'm just gonna throw out there that I think economic stability is a byproduct of enough housing, enough childcare, enough connectivity, wastewater that enables that. So I think economic stability, unless somebody has a different definition.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to jump in so quickly, sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, economic stability does sound like an outcome, and at the same time, I was in a conversation yesterday about the criticality of training and education and opportunities that link employers and persons of low and moderate income to those opportunities. So it is, sorry. Would you read that? Wendy is saying, which makes a lot of sense, gee, isn't economic stability an outcome rather than a category? But on the other hand, like, when we state what our objectives are, right, our objectives are economic stability. So did we articulate our objective? Yes. So, addresses, and we talked about the fact that they lived in both places. All I wanted to throw out is beyond housing and childcare, there are other contributors to economic stability, and they're myriad. And I'm just using workforce training as an example of that. You know,
Access to capital, I mean, all
Access to
all the
capital,
supports that we've really grown over the last 20 years in the Cape,
right,
so.
right.
Unless there's something that I'm seeing missing there, I don't know if there's something that's fundable that buys you economic stability. That's merely.
I'm gonna just
Yes,
say,
please.
in terms of the ARPA criteria, I guess the one thing, as I was reading it, like our mission and its source is, it did seem to be focused on the reestablishment of economic stability post-COVID. So this seemed like a tip of the hat to that.
Yeah, I think economic stability as a descriptive term is somewhat nebulous, right? I mean, pretty far reaching.
Quality of life.
So although through the small and medium grants program, we might see some ideas
Gotcha.
as a mega project, I think it's hard to get our hands on. If part of the charge of what we want to do is to make sure that there's a substantial amount of money that we want to fence off to be used in an area that we think can produce something that's transformational. Economic stability probably doesn't rank high.
But it's an outcome.
It is a,
Yeah,
it is an
Is
outcome.
Wendy's point.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's even in the past commission that was confusing. Is that economic development is a measure of how you balance sort of the place and the people. Business development as a subcomponent of economic development is something where you can see investments or proposals. I would think infrastructure is an incredibly broad category also. I do think the broadband component of it is something that is more easily understood and finite, but again, requires a massive, requires more funds than are available at the county level. Wastewater is a component of both water quality and infrastructure.
So what about EV charging stations? What about burying under, electricity underground, make us more resilient for climate? Again, really expensive projects, but maybe is there something instead of like actually doing it, do we get to a point of something that the county needs to enable more power underground and more EV stations built or?
Yeah. That's a good point because it's been part of our
whatever
conversation with the collaborative and another conversation we had with Cape Tech yesterday, specifically around EV charging stations as an example, which would then fall in the infrastructure and the climate category. So I think we can envision in the smaller and the medium grants program that we might get some proposals that come in and you can see how they might be graded higher, right? If they are covering both, checking the box of both sort of climate and infrastructure. But there are 80-something, hi Karen.
I was just gonna ask, is there anything from the emergency preparedness group? Bubbled out.
Which one?
The region.
The Barnstable County Emergency. Do you mean in terms of funding priorities?
Infrastructure.
Relative to infrastructure,
None that comes to mind.
Like generators for
Yeah, I mean,
large, so that people can continue to work or.
I see Sean has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Quick footnote on the broadband. So back of the envelope calculations for every business and residence that have like a fiber to the home connection, it would cost probably about on the order of about 300 million. So in relation to other infrastructure needs, while that seems like a massive number, in comparison to things like wastewater or affordable housing, the cost of fiber to the home connectivity for the entire Cape is pennies compared to the other infrastructure needs and price tags associated with that. The other, and as it relates to Wendy's point about resiliency and, which I think all of us probably love to see is, putting the electric transmission lines underground or what have you, which I've heard is would be stupendously expensive. Does the county or the or towns I'm not aware, are there any dig once policies? I mean, we're ripping up roads all of the time, and it seems like an opportune way to, while roads are ripped up, to be laying conduit for fiber and things of that nature, which would lower the cost of, last mile connectivity, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, is there any sort of dig once policy in place in this region?
Town by
Town by town.
It's a town by town issue. Mass DOT has a rule that if they pay for it, you can't, once they pay it, you can't rip it up for 5 years. But that should spark towns to consider this sort of inclusive, sort of beneath the streets approach. I'm not sure how many towns have adopted that. I do know at the commission, when we would get developments through the DRI process, at times we would ask them to do just that if they were ripping things up, put conduit on, and there was a ton of pushback. because they felt they were putting empty tubes in the ground that were never gonna be used and weren't connected and weren't even part of a plan to be connected. So there's work to be done there, but I think that's something we should follow up on, Sean, just to sort of evaluate where the 15 towns are on it. I think it's also, I know the commission has, in their plan, maybe Christie wants to weigh in on this, a regional capital plan that they are considering, and I think items like that could be part of that regional capital planning process. Okay. So economic stability is big and vague. Climate change, also one of those issues that is large, although there are smaller components like EV charging stations, but we do have the complication of potential changes to regulations based on Supreme Court decisions that are forthcoming. Infrastructure is also big. I mean, they're all big. But if we have this 42 million, I guess, available total at the county level, 10 million has been made available to the towns directly. How many proposals are in on that? Five proposals. They're all wastewater.
Yes.
So 5 proposals in, they're all wastewater. That leaves 32 million. If the recommendation is that 5 million go to small and medium grants program, that leaves 27 million.
There's some admin costs in there, so call it 30.
30 million. So I think that as we sort of have discussion of these regional challenges, and we want to do something that's big and transformational, I think there are 2 questions. One is how, with 20 million or 25, how many of these large projects or issue areas could be addressed with that effectively? And then whatever number that is, which ones would we select from the 6? So I think in previous discussions, there have been some discussions about maybe 2 mega projects or larger projects, potentially 10 million piece or more. Looking at that might be enough to sort of do something that was substantial. Is there a comment on the number or reaction to that number? Should it be 1? Should it be 3?
Are we gonna ask for a large project proposal from somebody? We're gonna put it out for bid? Or are we gonna go do it?
Well, this is the other issue that we're going to deal with. I'm not sure we would get a $10 million proposal to do something transformative on a regional basis from any single entity. And we do have some proposals that come in, say like on housing, right? But that's used a significant amount of money, 5 or 10 million, to subsidize or to match a subsidized program on the state level. And I think we've addressed that piece of it earlier.
Well, I mean, like, what if we went to the federal government and the state government and went to Joint Base Cape Cod and said, we need a chunk of land, we're gonna build housing, we're gonna have transportation, and we're also gonna do some clean energy, try to get it off the grid, just build something ourselves versus, gee, Dan, you got an idea? You know, that kind of a thing. Because I think that matters too.
But yeah, I think it begs the question. So if there were,
So good.
well, you can't talk, so.
No, I can. I got
Oh, my
my.
God. Oh, that's so wonderful.
No, I was not sick. I had a temporary problem in my throat, which is completely gone now. Sorry. But it is.
Yay.
Karaoke will do that to you.
Yeah, I will. I've been there too. It's a little bit so raspy.
Well, I mean, it's like, who's gonna do this? Are we gonna just parcel it out? Who's gonna deploy the money? And how much confidence do we have in whatever is it their idea, or is it our idea?
And so Wendy is, proposing something that I know a lot of people have had on their mind, which is a big, hairy, audacious goal. It always gives me the creeps to say that, but that would make a massive impact, integrate all of the focus areas that are identified here, and be coordinated in a way where it wasn't hoping that somebody would come up with this piecemeal, but actually have a vision of something that would make be a pilot, so we catalyze other action as well by the how-to, but bring in appropriate, the leadership would actually come from the county, leveraging all of the appropriate parties, but addressing there's such a total unanimity about agreement of what these issues are. Could that be a vehicle for sustainable change by actually effectuating something?
Yeah.
I would
Karen,
say the same thing. Should I think I'm in.
I've got to get my vision checked.
I know, I
No court around
Are you on both? You're on,
Yeah, no, she's ready to go. But she's also on the left side of the screen.
I think that to that point, there's probably models that we can look at for that.
And we know of some, we actually know of some already, that some of our trustees have shared with us and some of our team members of exactly what we're talking about in areas where housing, wastewater, childcare, and talent are, and climate are difficult to access, and broadband, that there's actually been a project that was undertaken to address all of those with engagement of employers, with the engagement of the regional government, with the engagement of investors.
you're saying there is such a project?
There are such projects.
Yeah. And so,
Build the 16th town.
I mean, just not to jump ahead in the process, but the only place that we've identified really that has that has the scale to do something like that is the land on the base. Is that right? I mean, are we dancing around this issue or?
Oh, she just said it.
Yeah.
Somebody just said it.
So that, I mean, what we could definitely do with the amount of money we're talking about is we can do a feasibility study and an RFP. I mean, if you were gonna look at, obviously you can't build this stuff for that. But if you sort of tailor-made what it would look like and had someone really do the economics of it, you actually could do that and you could go to an RFP process. And you wouldn't, I don't think that would cost, I mean, how much would that cost? You looked at stuff like this in the past.
Yeah.
At another ex-airport.
I think that kind of project certainly is feasible with the money that's available to get it up and running, but there are issues of how do you sustain that long-term? What role does the county play? And sort of putting that out. And then if we come up with a model, but the base itself still requires some detangling of the leases and transfer of the cantonment area anyway, right? So, and I do think there are possibilities because if you look at the base operation, it's a multi-jurisdictional base, unlike any others. And you've got Space Force on the north part, right? So it isn't going anywhere. And you've got the airfield and the Coast Guard on the southern part, that's not going anywhere. You've got all the secret squirrel stuff there that potentially could go anywhere, but it's there now. But that cantonment area in the middle is still, is it necessary for military function? And if we could open up that as a transportation corridor, would that help as we construct two new bridges? Right, so definitely a worthwhile conversation to have. But I also think that I think what Dorothy's describing as a model for the development of what he's discussed could be put together in a way that's transferable, maybe even smaller parcels. Like if you have 17 acres in Sandwich or Truro Island Center, another piece. So that's very interesting and potentially transformational for the Cape.
You call it ARPA City.
Arborville, yeah.
Dorothy.
As part of the feasibility study, and I know this is not an original idea, as many great minds have been thinking about a way through on this for a long time, is in order to provide for that portability of the model, could part of the feasibility study include the assessment of the appropriate vehicle for managing such a project, for also being able to attract and direct income streams, for, that would be,
Business
so,
plan,
pardon me?
the business plan.
Yeah, and so, but again, knowing, because before you said, well, who would do that, is, maybe part of the feasibility study is the who.
Yeah, the who or the what, right? Because it has to be,
Yeah, sorry, and then what?
Yeah.
That was a great distinction, thank you.
because you have these resources available, you're gonna do the feasibility study, there has to be some governance of that,
That's
those
right.
resources
That's,
at some level. That's not gonna, so,
What would you say?
just, there has to be some sort of governance of those resources when you use that at some level.
I'm not familiar with the models you're talking. So
well,
I have some in my mind that I'm familiar with, but I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
and we'd be happy to share some of them with you. Paul Grover shared one from Aspen, just at Western.
Paul Grover, was it?
Yeah.
Paul G?
Yeah. No, Paul Grover is just a member of my, he was with
It's like a model from
Robert
Aspen.
Paul, but identified for us in his research a model from Aspen. That, they have all of the issues we have, wastewater, transportation, talent, climate, and childcare, big restricted geography. And it was quite an extraordinary development. And over the years, we've seen others as well.
So this is a good discussion. I think we kind of wandered into a nice approach here, which is let's consider the money that's available and go through each issue area and see what might be possible. There's a lot of possibilities on the housing side. I would throw out that maybe the issue of homelessness
Yes,
be included
yeah.
as part of housing initiatives. I think there are issues with the shelter and a need for a respite program. That would definitely fall within the really meaningful kind of first time differences that we've been waiting 25 years to make with not a lot of money that could be part of a coordinated regional housing initiative. Good.
I agree with everything you just said. And I guess the one question I have is that I know that you're not indicating that that would be to the exclusion of underwriting something like that with the non-mega, because I know, and, Duffy and others, right, are proposing, expansion of respite programs, just as you've addressed. I'm only using them as one example of an organization focused on homelessness. I know you have had a particular focus on that. And so that if there were existing organizations that were to submit grants in smaller categories, that we would include that in our consideration, or they would include that in their consideration as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, nothing in what's been drafted on small and medium grants today would preclude that at all.
Well,
Yeah.
the other thing on this list that does not necessarily involve a lot of bricks and mortar and infrastructure investment is the childcare one. And I mean, if I knew that for X percentage of this $42 million, there would be universal childcare on Cape Cod.
Yeah.
There's nothing we could do that would be immediately more supportive relative to economic sustainability than to have that stable, predictable, knowable. Now, I know the state is talking about doing that, and the federal government's talking about doing that. So I don't know, obviously we don't want to duplicate it, but if we really wanted to support the people working here and trying to raise families here, that is a huge part of it.
Yeah.
Now, is that happening at a regional basis?
Yeah, we discussed that a little bit at the beginning of the meeting.
Sorry.
So the federal childcare legislation seems to be stalled. But the state Senate did a pretty aggressive piece of the budget, which I think could survive conference. And that would be meaningful. But there are some really creative local stuff that's going on too. So Jackie Beebe's leadership in East End has been incredible. Town Mashpee's school superintendent also. So I think part of that, promoting that could be to get the the local governments, municipalities engaged. If there's additional resources from the state, and then we can get the municipalities to put some resources, that creates a sustainable approach to childcare, which I think could be transformative.
Could we, could we offer an opinion on how the town should spend their share? Could we say, I mean, we heard early on from our state legislators that the towns are awash in cash now. Best
way to do that is to match.
I mean, could we go to them and say, we think the town should take a portion of their windfall and invest in universal pre-K, and then we'll do. So, I mean,
Yeah.
is that in our purview, or do we not want to go there?
We already have 5 applications in.
For childcare?
No, they're all wastewater.
They're always hard.
And, right, so I mean, what we're hearing is they're taking resources from the county ARPA, looking for what the state's gonna provide for, right, and they're gonna cobble it all together. And Jared actually pulled information from different meeting minutes, et cetera, that talked about this exact approach. So I'm not sure at this point if we can go back but going forward, right, if some of the eligible entities for and we're getting kind of jumping around, but going back, because the conversation we're having is about the large projects.
Right.
But if we were to go back with the small and medium projects, that is a consideration, that if.
Give them more weight.
Right, and I think we said, and there's been no decision made, but what the proposal talks about is having municipalities be an eligible recipient for small and medium grants. So if you wanted to make some, weighting or criteria or matching requirements, it's that what I would suggest would be the time to do it. I think it's hard at this point.
Or we could say, we're gonna use our large pool of this, so,
That's, yeah,
and then the smaller funds could take the other.
that's another option, yeah.
Right. Sean, is here.
Another approach, absolutely.
Yeah, just real quick, just thinking about civil lytics as well, but just do we have, or have we talked about a sort of a specific criteria as it relates to the likelihood of any particular projects or potential funding areas and their likelihood of having an ability to get sources, to get funding sources elsewhere, as being like a specific thing to consider in terms of, because I feel like on some level, there ought to be some weight given to projects that this might be their only bite at the apple, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah, we have in the, we have a project selection criterion that addresses whether or not a project leverages alternative funding sources. It's
Line 14.
It's actually
But I think Sean, what I'm hearing, Sean, you say that it goes beyond that. It's are there projects that could only be funded by this? And I look at sort of the homelessness piece of it. That's not something the state's going to give any extra money to around some of those creation of those facilities. It's not something any town's going to do on its own, but it is something that the region has needed for 20 years. So I think it does fall into that category, that one bite at the apple, one opportunity.
Yeah.
And there may be others. So on the childcare side, I'm also concerned about the sustainability of it. Because the towns have to be in it for good, schools, districts have to be in it for constant funding. Now, to the extent that we have to create additional physical capacity to accommodate more slots, that might be something. But the Y already has some state funding for the purpose of expansion. And then economic stability is wide ranging. I don't know what we would do with $10 million at that level on economic stability. climate change, 10 million. Could we support a climate change program that looked at mitigation and adaptation? Or could we support implementation of a climate action plan with 10 million, potentially. But I do think, as noted in the discussion about the base and the potential creation of that community out there, that climate change is something that has to be integrated into any proposal that requires building anything.
Right. Right.
And then infrastructure, also massive. And there are a lot of resources out there. The IIJA has a lot of money in it. That's probably where a lot of bridge money is going to come from. And there's a big wastewater component to that on the federal level, as well as the Water Protection Trust Fund that's been set up here locally that's funding projects annually now, as well as a proposal from the governor that the legislature is considering now to give $200 million to the Cape to be used for the septic loan program at the county level, which now can be used to offset hookup fees. And
deal with Title V.
And do a Title V and capitalize the Water Protection Trust Fund.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a ton of money for a wastewater out there,
Right.
which the town's having 5 proposals and they're all wastewater. That makes my heart warm on some level because they at least recognize that it's a priority that's going forward. Whether that's the best use of a limited source of funds, I think is a different question. But I think we have to consider that. So if at this point it's a consensus of the committee that we should identify 2 of these regional challenges for further discussion as large grant projects, and understanding that in that discussion, fencing out some of that money, I think we as a committee are going to have to direct that discussion. I don't think there's any one proposal out there that's going to come forward. So that would require subsequent meetings just on those 2 large issues to sort of define that. Then I think maybe the committee is ready to consider those 2 issue areas.
Can I ask a question? When you say homelessness, how would you actually direct the money? What would the money do?
Well, I think there's massive improvements that need to be made at the shelter. That's one of them.
Right. Another way to think about it, just under the housing, umbrella, is that there's, if you look at a continuum, homelessness is one piece of it. A model community, and I don't really know what it is, that looks like. Because I don't know if we are going to have just one project that would, if housing was chosen, that there would be one project. But I know that there has been a proposal put together that combines, it's kind of a venture with improvements to the shelter, and then I'm not sure if it's a co-location model with medical respite. So that's, that's one model that's been put together with the agencies that do that work, Catholic Social Services and Duffy. But that, that's not the entire housing, obviously. So it's almost, I always look at it as along a continuum. And where, if you look at all of the things we've already talked about, selection criteria, regional challenges, cross-cutting issues, is there a way to combine some of these things together? That would fit under again, an example, under a housing category. So it's just another way to look at it. I don't think that one project around housing and around homelessness and medical respite is it's not the only thing you would want to. I would not consider under housing. There's other things that have to be. And I think that's where I think there would be value. And once if it is 2 areas are identified, really drilling into some of the proposals that we've seen and where they might fit.
Yes.
Certainly on housing, you could set a criteria for a minimum impact that would be considered. So you would say, the proposals have to be proposing at least X number of units, or some, so you didn't get sort of one-offs.
Yeah.
So, it will go to scalable projects that really look holistically at developing housing that includes and really set criteria and say at least 200 units or something. So by doing that, by setting criteria fairly high, you would be eliminating 99%. I'm looking at Christie now, but how many places on the Cape? And you can throttle up or down the criteria, knowing what would be eligible.
Just to speak to that, we had a meeting yesterday with staff around, thinking through this whole, what would be possible with a housing development. And the time constraints put in place by ARPA make it nearly impossible to think about development, like as we think about an affordable housing development. I think, what did staff say? It took like 8 to 10 years from beginning to end. Now, there may be some, and again, we're looking into that to see if there's other kind of, not outside the box, but other ways to, to look at how we could support housing development, affordable housing.
So the output couldn't be the RFP? It would have to be the bricks and mortar?
Or the feasibility.
Right, so we
Or the
could look at the
feasibility
phasing, like there may be projects that are at a particular phase that need a little bit more to get over the finish line. So we're kind of taking a deeper dive into what might be possible under that. But there are, the time constraints for, just from a start to finish development project are it's not gonna work for.
Yeah.
But there are, we also looking at, where the gaps are, there's been down payment closing cost assistance programs, which when they're funded with federal dollars, because of our housing costs and the AMI that's required, you can't get the program to work with federal dollars. The criteria just don't work for us. And then you look at a place like a Habitat that, that purchases land and then builds homes on. I mean, is that another, so I think we're doing the work to kind of look in a little bit deeper, given the constraints of ARPA, what might be possible, if we were to cobble together different, related housing projects, and bring that back. And we have quite a few, we have some suggestions already that we've been pulling together. But there may be some ways to do to fund a development project, even with the ARPA constraints, if that's what the group decides.
Yeah, merge ARPA funding into a process that's already underway.
Yeah.
Like towns are doing with their wastewater projects.
Yeah.
Same thing.
It's a phase.
You're not gonna build a lot of houses for 10 million.
No, you're not.
No,
But what you can do is look at resources that are already here that could be pooled. You can identify areas where you would want housing. You can look at, advocating for zoning changes for more multifamily. So you could look at a potential entity that might be able to bring together a regional housing strategy, the implementation of a regional housing strategy.
I'm sorry.
No,
If you take the cost of the land, for example, off the table,
Right.
then all of a sudden the 30% threshold can work.
Yes.
And so to that point, you're not going to build the housing, but you can buy a lot of land for $10 million.
Right.
Yes.
Wendy.
to Dan's point is, I also think that ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are already enabled in most of the towns, except people don't know how to do it, right? It's like, the other day, I got another barn, I can put an ADU in my barn. I'm a relatively smart person, I know people to ask, and I'm like, I don't know where to start. I'm gonna start with my septic system, but if you could there's some way to spark people that want to have ADUs.
Yeah.
There's a pilot.
But maybe it's a coordinating agency.
The Housing Assistance Corporation has actually done work on putting together that how-to package, and I think they were funded in the November bill. That's something we want to reach out to them on.
I guess I could just keep going back to something you said a few moments ago about the entity, and I'm thinking about all of the different elements of it, and Beth described it so effectively, which is it is a continuum, right? There's from there's homelessness prevention, which is Karen, who she leads our community engagement committee, we're very, very focused on. Then there's persons of low and moderate income in need of housing. Then there's workforce that is never going to qualify for any of the federal things that are in need of housing. And it is that, and then it's the families that may well make, and a lot of the work for me, very good salaries, but they simply cannot find the housing and for a larger home with kids, things like that. So going back again to a point that you made about the entity, I guess one of the things for me is we keep coming back to the fact that housing is the major challenge. It incorporates all these others, but it's the major challenge facing Cape Cod and Barnstable County. And yet, in order to be efficacious in moving things ahead, knowing that there's going to be different projects, different players, things like that, it does seem like a coordinating entity that is staffed and has the ability to evaluate, APCC and HAC just did an analysis of opportunistic places for placing housing. What is it that you need to do your next step, Paul, that you mentioned, which is identifying the housing changes, the infrastructure changes, the attraction of potential RFPs for it. It again, rather than thinking about the 10 million as one project or 3 projects or something, in terms of capacity building, to me, it seems like creating that vehicle, I said it correctly that time, that can, it was from being in Kentucky that they say vehicle. You should know that. So creating the vehicle that could actually move this forward, that could undertake the RFPs, that could work the multiple projects, could be the most sustainable way of having this opportunity create something that will continue. So I know I've sort of solidified on that, and I'm sorry, because this is open-ended discussion, but I just think that point that's been raised is something we shouldn't lose sight of.
Yes, and the commission is ready to do their housing study, right? So that will build on a lot of the work that's been done in their regional policy plan with HAC and APCC and the mapping project. It will provide a lot of that data and information that I think is necessary to move forward. But the commission's not an implementing entity, so what do you do at that point? That was always the challenge. But with wastewater, you know who the entities are. They're the towns because they're public systems. So there is a gap there, right? Where we don't have an entity that could implement that. And also housing is sort of almost a universal problem, but it hits the Cape very differently.
But now you have the CDCs, with the CDP on the Outer Cape, and you have HAC.
Yeah,
as a CDC.
We do, but they, their mission is really rooted in affordable housing, the creation of affordable housing. And I think we're talking about here something a little broader. And I also think that if we talk about cross-cutting issues and we look at sort of climate change and other issues like that, and you look at sustainability of revenue sources, right? If, properties that are within 1,100 feet of the coastline were subject to a higher regional tax of some sort, you might have some sustainable funding that could not only build housing, but then be reactive to adaptation needs and potential retreat programs. And so that, I think housing has always suffered from being viewed as a problem instead of part of a bunch of problems. But I think there's more work and investigation that needs to be done. But the Cape, we can't sprawl into the desert to build housing. And 86% of the land is developed or protected. 82% of the housing stock are single-family homes, compared to a state average that's in the 20s. So a unique entity that just looked at housing implementation on the Cape, I think, is probably an idea that's worth considering as part of a housing initiative. And so I think this discussion has been a good one in looking at housing as the #1 issue, probably, if we all had to rank that individually, and things that we could do that are appropriate given the scale of resources available to do. But it's going to require further development by this committee and some questions, maybe bringing in CEP, Housing Assistance Corporation, and having some discussions with them, funding the commission study so that can move forward. But it's good. So, you know, I think the housing discussion we've hashed out here, and it seems to be the consensus of the committee that that would be one of the large project issue areas. But I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. And we haven't really addressed water quality yet, other than to talk about the need for wastewater, but wastewater as infrastructure is really where we see the money available right now. There are, of course, other water quality issues regionally. And it is an area where the county has demonstrated some leadership in the past. And so there's a freshwater initiative, pond initiative that needs to happen that I think fits that one bite unique kind of piece. And I also think that the county, for example, has assets in the county lab, in the test facility, wastewater test facility at the base, in the dredge, in the fact that it hosts the Water Protection Trust Fund and the septic loan, that if coordinated, could be transformational for the region. And I think that kind of coordination is probably consistent with the amount of money that we have available. But I would be interested in other people's sort of perspective on that before we move to select two.
Well, in full disclosure, I do live on a pond, so a little bit of self-interest, but if you could do an assessment of where I know APCC has their program on cyanobacteria, and there's stuff going on, but there's no sort of comprehensive study done on freshwater quality, other than anecdotal, like it is in bad shape now.
It is increasingly in bad shape, probably somewhat related to climate change. But what needs to happen, because there are such proposals out there already, is an analysis of the individual ponds themselves, because the nature of the ponds, whether they're spring fed, the bathymetry of a certain pond, will dictate what potential solutions there are to deal with the pollution in those ponds. So that's not really a study, but that is baseline work that needs to be done. It's difficult to move forward without that. I think you see in a lot of towns the discussion about a pond is in bad shape. Let's dump some alum in it, right?
Is it an assessment?
No, I'm saying this is what I hear because people just associate alum as a solution. It is not a solution in every instance. So I think more work needs to be done in order to categorize the ponds in a way that leads to the most effective selection of potential solutions to the issues that they're facing.
And who does that, the county?
So, I mean, Christie's on the call, but the commission had put together a really comprehensive fresh ponds initiative.
Yeah, freshwater pond initiative.
Thank you. That looks at a lot of these different issues in a very comprehensive way. But I don't want to speak for Christie, she's on. We just had the presentation. Well, the commissioners got it a while ago. The assembly got it a while ago, but it's a really comprehensive look at freshwater.
PFAS too?
The PFAS.
It's a water quality issue that needs to be monitored, right? It's not yet a regulated compound, but there's more testing going on. And I think that's potentially where, reformulated county lab
right.
could be essential.
Right.
Christy, do you have something?
No, not necessarily. Just echoing what Beth had discussed, that we do have a fairly large freshwater initiative that we're ready to kind of move on as soon as everyone's ready. So it would provide that baseline analysis, that background, really kind of getting a sense of the status of each of the ponds, and then putting together strategies, working with the community stakeholders and developing kind of a plan to move forward. But that communications piece, the pond monitoring piece, all of that needs to come into the initiative as well. But we've got that outlined and scoped, and the first part we'd be ready to go with is the economic analysis, and we've got a consultant already ready to go.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Chrissy, but so the bulk of the work gets done, but this is also a program that could be sustainable through the Water Protection Trust Fund.
It could be, definitely. In the Water Protection Fund itself, legislation actually contemplates additional funding for monitoring. So if that gets expanded, freshwater would be, freshwater was eligible, it would make complete sense.
Thanks. Right, so, I think it would be the right time to entertain a motion by the committee to identify the top 2 regional issues that will be subject to further discussion and considered as potentially large grant programs.
I'll make a motion for one of them.
Housing,
I'll make a motion for water.
housing, water quality. Do we have any other contenders for top 2?
Do you like broadband?
I do too. I was just thinking that one.
Yeah. I think the medium grant program,
Okay.
because, Sean's point is right. If you put, broadband and last mile as a total project next to wastewater or the bridges,
Looks like-
it's pretty small.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still bigger than what we have available. But if municipalities form their own sort of broadband utilities and could leverage property tax funds for it, that would be a way to leverage certainly enough money to do that. And so I think that's where the sort of broadband piece falls in.
Yeah. I think I agree with that, although, of course, from my narrow perspective, I mean, broadband is, touches on literally everything that we're discussing. It's a part of affordable housing, as it relates to affordable utility. It relates to retaining businesses and attracting businesses. It relates to telehealth and all of the various aspects that it. So yes, but in recognition that with the limited funds that we have, outside of a few sort of pilot projects and or helping leverage or using this money for municipalities to leverage moving forward, there's not a lot here.
Yeah, and the issue of sustainability, I think that the municipalities have to be engaged in order for that to be a sustainable program.
Is the Comcast infrastructure going to be obsolete?
Is it obsolete?
It's going to be obsolete.
Yes. And Comcast and Comcast and Verizon have no intention of, bringing, there's the reason why they call fiber, fiber future-proof for a reason. It lasts for, 50 years. It's more expensive to build, but orders of magnitude less expensive to maintain and to operate. And and also, fiber has a lot, it has the potential as well of creating savings for, monitoring water systems and so forth, and the operational costs that it can save. Municipal utilities across the country got into fiber for that very reason, to better monitor electric and water systems and to identify problems before they arise and save money, et cetera. So in other words, broadband's not just about wires or binging on Netflix. It's fundamentally tied into sort of every aspect of modern life, and enabling a lot of things. So in that regard, it would be completely transformational. But I think, as Paul has mentioned, but in terms of Comcast, I mean, there's the issue of the degraded network that Comcast maintains, and then there's also the issue of just monopoly, and what happens when you have a monopoly and the incentives that are not there to invest in that infrastructure and improving it, or competing on price and service and things of that nature. To say nothing of when you have your own broadband utility, that money stays within the community versus it being hundreds of millions of dollars being extracted out of this community from a monopoly, that for the benefit of shareholders elsewhere.
We've had this discussion as it relates to Eversource and National Grid and all of the other utilities that we have given away, all of the other necessary public convenience that we've given away. The question is there, when you look at spending big amounts of money, the reason I asked if it was obsolete is there's an argument to be made for taking that back rather than building a whole new network. And how do you go about taking it back? Not with this Supreme Court, but I mean,
You're gonna have to pay for it.
well, there is a public necessity. I mean, the roads out here, we didn't privatize them.
But, I mean, you can take broadband infrastructure by eminent domain if you want, but you gotta pay for market value.
Yeah. Which was an obsolete network. See, the thing is, you'd be better off taking the Comcast one if it's obsolete and just buying it and throwing it out, because then you've created a cash flow for what you're trying to build.
Right.
Because then everybody would be paying into it. And they're paying into a public utility model as opposed to paying a private monopoly, as he said. So, because then you could forward fund it on cash flow. And you could do a 50-year plan if the cable lasts 50 years. And that, I bet you people would be paying less if you did it that way.
But it's also on poles.
Oh, yeah, then the whole thing is a hairball. I'm sorry,
Right.
unless you put it underground, maybe.
That's-
So as Sean's pointed out, will be a ton of broadband money available, but most of it will be directed to those parts of the country that are not connected
They're
at all.
just deserts.
So it's unclear how much of that money sort of funneled down to us. And broadband clearly is an access issue, right? Access to healthcare, access to other sort of basic fundamental things. I think the best thing we can do is get the towns engaged. I mean, Falmouth is there. They're looking at actual costs and benefits to towns. If there were proposals that would come in that was going to address maybe like digital divide, maybe that's, something we could consider.
Yep. Well, and there's also some potential in terms of looking at, building new housing, multi-dwelling units, affordable housing units to make sure they're, wired for that kind of connectivity. Because there is money in the infrastructure bill specifically for that type of work.
Yeah, back to the discussion of a large sort of housing complex, but that would be fiber ready, and maybe on a microgrid, that kind of sustainable, community development pieces of great interest.
Well, with broadband, the satellite technology that's coming up, Sean and I might not agree on this, but some of the satellite technology coming up, you actually could get Wi-Fi into communities through satellite rather than hardwire in the future.
Cool.
No, I know.
Okay, we'll leave that one there. So we have a
Let's buy a
motion.
satellite. Let's buy a satellite.
Yeah.
Can't buy the satellite. So we have a motion on the floor, two motions on the floor. One motion on the floor is that housing be one of the two regional challenge areas that qualifies for a large grants program. Do I hear a second? Karen seconds that. So all in favor? Aye. Say aye, raise your hand.
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
Well, just do a roll call vote.
Roll call vote.
Yeah, I think.
Wendy,
Motion again.
the motion is that housing be a regional challenge issue area that qualifies for the large grant program. Roll call, Wendy,
Yes.
Dan,
Aye.
Dorothy,
Aye.
Karen,
Aye.
Lisa,
Aye.
John.
Aye.
Okay, housing's in. The second motion made by Wendy was that water quality be considered one of the two top regional issue area priorities for large grants. So there's a second on water quality.
That water quality and wastewater as well.
I'll second.
Karen had a correct clarifying
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, it's
Karen's-
water quality / wastewater.
Water quality / wastewater. So we have a motion, we have a second by Lisa. So roll call vote. Wendy,
Yes.
Dan,
Yes.
Dorothy,
Yes.
Karen,
Yes.
Lisa,
Yes.
Tom.
Yes.
Great. Well, we have our two large project issue areas identified. So at the next meeting, we will take up and focus on housing. And I will open it up to the committee, but if there are any suggestions for people or entities that you would like to be present at the next meeting and part of that discussion, please let Beth know by email. And we will make the invite. So those two having been selected, we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the review of the proposal outline to offer small and medium-sized grant funding opportunities. So this is the proposal that Vera walked through.
Yeah, it's just, it's got the edits that, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, so that Vera walked through last time, and it is edited. So that is open for discussion.
Have elongated some of the timeframes at the front of it, with the intent of trying to maintain the endpoint.
Is there any discussion? Karen?
I just have one question on, is it our intent to have invitation only after the letter of intents are accepted? Or are we just, is it a formality to do a letter of intent?
It's a great question.
Yes. Remember what we talked about.
I think it's open for conversation, but I think the logic flow is that it's, after a letter of intent is a necessary part of the process, would be a necessary part of the process, so as to allow us to identify, capacity, sort of help advise the applicant, potential applicant, identify capacity issues if there are any, and also find synergies between different disparate incoming projects.
This was our opportunity, if there were 2 or more applicants that had similar projects, to kind of bring them together before they each submitted. So, but I don't think there's anything that we would say someone would be eligible if it's eligible for ARPA, right? This is an opportunity to get them to work together before full proposal goes in.
Did you have some thought otherwise?
No, I've just seen it work both ways. And there's any value in it.
But there is a larger issue of, is the LOI, is that the point at which, is that a sort of a gatekeeping thing? In other words,
Yeah.
you come in and you send your LOI and we look at it and say, we don't think you have the capacity to provide the reporting in the back end and sort of thing, but does that necessarily preclude them from going on and applying anyway?
Waste their time.
It's that's a decision that has to be made. And also relative to scoring, I mean, we've got this proposed, this is kind of the best stab at an equitable, thoughtful way to try and score incoming incoming proposals. But, how and if do we apply this? If there aren't enough, for example, as I have here noted, if there aren't enough proposals that come in that would absorb the funding available, do we still score it? In other words, do we recommend as a committee that there be a minimum score? That the idea has to have a minimum score in order to qualify for funding, even if it's not kind of, a competitive situation. That's a decision that I think the committee can make, or can provide advice on for the commissioners.
That's how the feds do it for literacy. Well, for ARPA and for
For
any
ARPA?
other funding, there's a minimum score.
Has to be a minimum
Fund
score.
to- Not that we have to do it that
Mhm.
way. It's just-
So I sent a consensus on the committee that there should be a minimum score. Does anyone disagree with that? No, I think we can take that as sort of guidance.
Good.
Dan,
So we're recommending this process to somebody, to the
to the
commissioners.
commissioners. But my question is, who is going to vet? Who's going to apply this?
It's up to them.
We are,
Okay, so you have the capacity to do that?
You mean we?
no, sorry.
Yeah.
So, no. Yes, Wendy, no.
You.
No, we are building some capacity in-house to do this. We're hiring some staff. We have more money for some administrative support, so yeah.
But we, internal county staff, not necessarily scoring. I mean, there needs to be, I think, a sort of an open and transparent process for scoring in incoming projects. And Dan has raised this before, a subsequent committee appointed in order to do this.
Which is C, so it's 2C,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Okay.
So we again, something that needs to be determined, if we could pull together a review committee to help us with some of this work. But as far as, getting people online, providing technical assistance, going through the letter of intent, the bidders conference, et cetera, and then just managing it, we're gonna have the internal capacity to do it. But we've used these kind of review committees. I mean, it helps. But it's not necessarily this group, it could be members of this group.
Okay, well, it's on the table, so I would entertain a motion to forward these project evaluation metrics and scoring to the commissioners for their consideration, and to earmark and begin the appropriation, appropriate $5 million for that purpose. And is the split between the 5 million worked out between small and large?
Yeah,
It's two for small, 3 for medium.
2 for small, 3 for large.
two
for
for
medium.
small, 3 for medium.
Yes.
Yeah.
So moved.
Second, Lisa.
So I'm trying to understand why we would keep column C in this metrics and scoring document. Just speaks to the large projects, which.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Let's see.
Yeah,
That's
I think we should
the
take the
large
large projects out because we,
Maximum.
yeah,
We actually discussed that last
Yeah.
time, yeah.
because the format,
It would only be small
Yeah.
and medium.
Would have
So for
different
right now,
criteria, maybe.
Right. So,
yeah, I think we did discuss that last.
So
Yeah.
for today's purposes, we'll just leave this.
Yeah, oh, sorry,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I took it out of the text, but the table still has, large in it, yeah.
So the large project, pink
Then,
column
yes.
will be removed.
Right.
And then one other question, I'm sorry. So the letter of intent would be required to submit an application, correct?
Yes.
But the letter of intent would not be used to invite an application.
I don't understand the distinction. Say again?
So you have to, if you're going to go through this process at all, you have to submit the letter of intent. That's the first step. Yes, just a clarifying question. Or could you go to the portal and submit an application without that? That was my question. Second was, so after the review of the letter of intent, is there a process in which the applicants would be invited or not invited to apply?
Yeah, they'd have to be, in other words, to get onto the portal to submit an application, you have to provide some information that we send to the portal people, and they basically enable the particular potential applicant to then go in, email, cell phones, sort of two-factor authentication and everything. So there's a process-related invitation to the portal. And then I think what you're getting at is there a qualitative aspect to the invitation to the portal? Right? I think that we will render an opinion on the letter of intent in terms of the person's capacity to perform and potential synergies, but we've not contemplated that being a stopping point for any particular idea.
So the letter of intent would go in, letter of intent would be evaluated.
Yeah.
It gives us that opportunity. Yeah.
The applicant will receive some feedback on the letter
Yes.
of intent saying either they met minimum qualifications or they didn't, for example, or they're deemed to have capacity or they're not, things like that.
Yeah.
An explanation, and those that meet minimum qualifications and are deemed to have capacity could move on to the portal.
Yes.
What if
But
it's,
that's the question I think Lisa's asking.
Yeah.
We don't, at this point, I won't speak for, I'm saying it's the royal we, I guess, it's just me, right? But we don't anticipate that being you can't proceed net of your letter of intent. Basically, letter of intent is going to advise us on ultimately how they can best spend their time, whether they apply or not, if you know what I mean. Your likelihood of succeeding relative to an application and the strength of your back office in order to be able to sustain reporting requirements and so on, is going to weigh on the likelihood of the success of your project based on what we know of the system and the expectations inherent in the scoring. We'll tell the person submitting the letter of intent that if they still want to submit,
Yeah, we're not gonna.
we don't envision barring them from doing that.
So if an applicant forwarded a letter of intent and it was deemed that they did not meet minimum requirements for ARPA and they do not have the capacity to implement the program, they would still be registered on the portal if they wanted to and be able to go through that process.
Yeah, well, if they're not going to submit something that's eligible for funding, I think.
Well,
Why would we set them up to submit an application?
So that's why
That's the question.
They would never make it through the first level.
Right, but that's why I assume there would be
Some
feedback
feedback.
saying that you don't
Yes.
qualify.
If
The
it's
process would say subsequent to the LOI, if accepted or whatever, you'd be invited to go to the next level.
right, so you're right. There might be someone who submits a letter of intent for something that we know is just not eligible for ARPA. We would let that person who submitted the LOI get information. But if somebody submits something that it could potentially be eligible for ARPA, we see that it's very similar to another organizations. We'll use that opportunity to try to join them together.
Right.
And if that doesn't happen, again, because if it's something that we know is eligible for ARPA, we don't want to say, don't apply, but that's where the minimum score then would be the criteria that,
Okay.
they're not gonna, because they have to meet all of these, selection criteria and get scored on it. So we need to do some more thinking on what would actually be the minimum score.
Okay.
That
Sean,
would kick people out. I don't think we haven't decided.
I'm sorry,
yet.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a hard stop. I've got to run for some work related stuff. So this is an important discussion. I'm glad it's being had. But I do need to.
thanks, John. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Are you going to be transparent about all the applications or LOIs that you receive? Is there going to be a list? Will you publicly know?
There has to be.
Certainly, I think this whole process is going to be as transparent as possible. Yes, because we need to be able to explain if for some reason somebody submitted an LOI for an ineligible ARPA project. I want to be able to have that documentation.
It would be nice, helpful, if possible, to refer somebody to some other sources.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yeah, we're gonna put together a whole package. That's why we're having
Yeah.
the pre-bidders, we're gonna have the pre-application. There's a multi-step pre-application process, because we want to make sure we're providing people information so that they don't waste their time.
Okay, so.
So there's a motion and a second on the floor for this recommendation of the commissioners. Roll call vote. Wendy,
Yes.
Dan.
Aye.
Dorothy,
Aye.
Karen.
Aye.
Lisa.
Hi.
Sean.
He's gone. Oh, he's gone.
Oh,
Oh, he's just frozen.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
he
I would
left.
say aye.
Okay. So is that-
Okay.
is that-
Dan heard say aye.
Okay.
He's got a-
We have a majority vote, so that carries, so that will move forward with that. We don't have anything else on the agenda today, other than we have,
Housing people.
we will have the housing meeting next week, and we have prioritized the two large projects. As a component of those two large projects, there is the freshwater study that is at the county level where the ARPA is, and the housing study. We could also entertain a motion to the commissioners that they fund those projects with ARPA funds.
So moved.
Second. Moved and seconded. Roll call. Wendy.
Yes.
Dorothy.
Thank you.
Dan.
Aye.
Dorothy.
Aye.
Karen.
Aye.
Lisa.
Hi.
John. Great. So entertain at this point a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Wendy.
Yes.
Dan.
Yes.
Dorothy.
Aye.
Karen.
Yes.
Lisa.
Hi.
All right, we're done, folks. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Have a great tour, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
Enjoy. See ya.
Thank you.